Hey y'all, welcome to the Team LocoFit Roundtable, hosted by me, Laurin Conlon, owner of Team LocoFit. Each week, I am joined by one of our coaches to dive headfirst into the nutrition, training, mindset, and coaching strategies we use with our clients. If you loved the show, please subscribe, leave us a review, tell a friend, you know the drill. And for more information about coaching, the programs we offer, and additional content, visit teamlocofit.com. All right, and we are back, and this week we're with Rick, our mental health therapist.
Hi.
And I'm really pumped for today's topic, as usual, but this is a really, really pertinent topic. Over the past year, I would say that a lot of people, in a variety of ways, have gone through a lot of life transitions. And so we want to talk about this in a kind of a broad sense first, and then we're going to narrow down on a few specific situations that I would think that most people, that at least our clients, have been dealing with, whether it's different, stressors on their relationships or different work, like whether it's literally different work or different role within work, or especially with kids and school and all that. So we're going to dive into it. But first, we wanted to touch kind of on the general how to handle life transitions, and obviously coming from a therapist perspective, how you would help somebody through this, because clearly this is something that happens constantly and we can't ever plan when these things are going to happen. So it's better to be armed with this knowledge, hopefully before you're hit with a really hard life transition. But this past year, I would say that everybody has been hit with some type of life transition, or maybe multiple, unfortunately.
Well, I don't think there's any way to disagree with the idea that the last year has been a life transition for everybody. It was a forced change that no one wanted. And I think that's what, at the heart of life transitions, that's at the core of it. Is there are certain transitions that we make that we choose. And this is our own decisions, we had our own reasons for doing it, and so it's a little bit easier to deal with. Life transitions are life changes that occur without our choice, without our knowledge, without our blessing. Those are the ones that are the most difficult to deal with. So first and foremost, when it comes to dealing with any life transition, no matter what it is, good or bad, it is normal and it is an unavoidable part of life. It's just a byproduct of being a human being. At some point, your life is going to change. Case in point, this last year, everybody had an agenda for 2020, and it got thrown in the trash, and everybody stopped doing whatever it was that they wanted to do, and they were all faced with transitions. Not just the idea of the pandemic and what that means in terms of getting toilet paper, but what it could mean for your job, what it could mean for your family. I know, and I'm sure you personally know, many people who were furloughed, who were laid off, who took salary cuts, whose companies cut back on hours, reduced benefits. We lost loved ones, we lost friends, we couldn't do our favorite activities, we couldn't participate in social gatherings. We still can't participate in social gatherings on a large scale or the scale that we used to. So these were all forced onto us. And so it's one of those parts where it's like, sometimes there's nothing you can do. A transition in life or these life changes, they're gonna happen. And so how do we deal with it? Because when we're talking about a life transition, what we're really talking about is change. And change for some people, and in some aspects, is a great thing. Change for other people at other times, not so great.
And when you're not expecting it, it's definitely the hardest, right? Like obviously if you're like, all right, I'm going back to school, like that is a big life transition, because obviously a lot of things are going to change. You might be changing the hours that you work or when you work, or you might be adding on school to work, or it might be changing stuff with your kids, whatever it might be. Those are changes, but those are a little bit more exciting because you're making that decision.
Right.
Like, I'm going back to school. It's just one example. But when it's like, all right, hey, you can't do any of these things, or, like you said, like your hours are cut, or what I had happen to a lot of clients was their hours were raised without really being compensated, because we've talked about before, like working from home, the lines got really blurry with boundaries, right? So there's so many things where people weren't really planning that, and that is definitely where it became really, really hard. And people, especially, there's some people who are really adaptable, which is a great trait, and then there's some people who are not adaptable, myself included. So there's some people who, these kinds of things happen and they just kind of let it roll off, and that's a great sign of high stress resiliency. But for some people, this can be really, really hard, and of course other times it's way more tragic, like, okay, you're working more or somebody died. Like those are very different emotions, and how you're going to feel with that change is going to be distinctly different.
Absolutely, yeah. And with life transitions, with these types of changes that are occurring in your life, I want people to understand that there's a wide range of emotions you're going to feel. And again, depending sometimes on which side of the coin you start on, right? If this is a forced change or if this is a change you're opting for, your emotions can be very different, but they can all be present at the same time. So it's common to experience fear. When you're going through a transition that hasn't been something you wanted, disappointment is a big part of it. Regret, excitement can be another one, anticipation. Uncertainty, which breeds into fear, which breeds into anxiety. So it's really important that I think I want our listeners to understand and to go through the emotions and understand that whatever it is that you're feeling through this transition is probably pretty normal and typical and actually expected. It's a part of the process to get through to the other side. And that's the most challenging part, is focusing on the future to come, right? Because oftentimes what happens is when we face a major transition, it narrows our focus to what's happening here and now, and we forget about what's to come, the benefits that are coming down the road, the change that this brings into our life, and the opportunity for growth, for development, to become a different person or a better version of ourselves, or whatever that is. So just even saying those words, you can see why it creates anxiety in people, because they're like, it's so uncertain, they don't know. But that's part of the issue. That's why anxiety, that's why fear. We're kind of programmed to hold on to similar patterns and similarities in our life, no matter if they're good or bad. It's just, we're kind of hardwired that way. So when change is forced on us and it's not something we even wanted, now it's like twice as hard to gear up and go through it. But I think one of the ways that I start trying to help clients is by changing the mindset of the here and now to be more future focused. Like, where are you going to be versus where you are right now? Where you are right now sucks. And it might be really hard. You might have lost your job, your relationship, your house, whatever. But it's temporary. And all of this will eventually pass and move forward. How do we get from now, where it's painful, to the benefit later?
Yeah, I would say that's the hardest part, is that people start to spiral because you're so overwhelmed with whatever's going on. And then it's not just the one thing, it becomes 5 other things now, and they're all wrapped into each other. And that's probably a really good, not probably, that is a really good way of framing it, instead of saying, okay, like, we're focusing on right now, we have to focus on future stuff. And I would say that probably the best way to instruct people to do this is to always have very like tangible things, right? Instead of being like, well, yeah, where do you want to be in the future? Like, oh, I just want to be happy. Like, that's probably not a good future representation. Like, you need to have something concrete, right?
Yes, I would agree. Realistic goals for yourself and an expectation of what's to come from this. Otherwise, yeah.
So like the house example, right? Like, be like, all right, well, the next step might be renting, you know, until you recover stuff, and then buying somewhere or whatever, or because, you know, maybe the housing market's crazy, or hey, it's a perfect time, like the next few years you should probably buy something. But like, you don't want to just be like, all right, I don't have a house right now, in the future I'll have a house again. Like, of course, but we need to be like a little bit more specific. Yeah,
people will use, what do they call them, like vision boards, right? They post pictures.
Yeah, something like that.
I don't use them, but I get it. It's just not my thing.
You probably have a really elaborate one. You just try to pretend like you don't.
I have
like
a
floor to
list. I have an entire wall in my house that's dedicated to future goals. No, but that idea is correct. Like, I think if you can identify a specific job with a specific task, with specific goals, with specific expectations, what you want your house to look like, your relationship to look like, what you want your future career to look like, your finances, whatever it is, your health, your body. We all have goals that we're shooting for, and when it's more specific, it becomes more obtainable. And what you do is you get rid of a lot of the crap that just gets in the way and kind of filters in. And it's like, if this does not help me get to what my goal is, why is it in my life? And it helps you prioritize a lot of different things along the way. And so, yeah, so when we narrow our focus, we pay attention to what's happening here and now. And what it does is it can make things much bigger and more overwhelming. And when we're overwhelmed, we tend to shut down, we tend to think that this is impossible, and all those negative emotions just begin to creep in and they amplify. And more importantly, what it makes you feel is powerless or helpless to the change that's actually happening. So when we resist change, we assume this defensive posture where we try and resist everything that comes with it. I don't want the change. We start thinking about why it's bad instead of why it's good. And so when we take that defensive posture with change, or any life transition that occurs, it only makes it more difficult and it prolongs your suffering. It keeps you in a state of pain and agony much longer than it needed to. It's kind of like, all right, this is going to hurt for 2 or 3 months, or it's going to hurt for a year. What do you want? well, everybody logically says 2 or 3 months, but until they're faced with the choice, you know, now it's a much more difficult thing to do. So yeah, the antidote to defensive posture is to be more flexible, and that's what you were talking about a little bit earlier. The more flexible you are, the better opportunities you're going to see, even the ones that you didn't know were there.
And what's hard is because, as always, this is like a balancing act, right? Because, okay, we need to be flexible, we need to be very like stress resilient, kind of like, all right, change is happening, let me accept it, let me go through it. But then at the other side, we're saying, okay, set these really specific goals, which is not very flexible, it's a little bit more rigid. And then at the same time, it's like, all right, well, if I set these goals, then what happens if I don't hit them? Like, I know for myself, and I'm sure other people listening too, sometimes we can be afraid to set specific goals, literally because I'm like, I don't want to lock into one thing, because then if I don't do that, then I'm going to be upset. That's clearly irrational. But the whole idea is not to set a specific goal so that you have to hit that one thing, so that you have a target. And if you do change along the way, like, that's okay. But if you don't set something specific, do you ever see that with people, like, where they set stuff and then they're like, oh, I didn't reach this thing, so now I'm a failure? It's like, no, you didn't reach that, but you reached this other thing, which is pretty much equivocal. It was just a different name or a different, well, whatever.
If the end goal is the end goal and you haven't reached it by a certain time, does it mean that you're never going to reach it? Or was it just unobtainable within this period in life? I mean, I don't know. If you had a person who came to you who was like, I don't know, 320 pounds, and they were like, yeah, inside of 2 years, I want to be 170 pounds with 6% body fat. Is that a realistic goal? I don't know. I mean, I don't think anybody would fault the person if, like, after 2 years they've lost 200 pounds, you know, or whatever, 150 pounds, and they're so much healthier, like cholesterol, blood pressure, all that's gone down. It's like, you've made progress, substantial progress. But if you're only looking at the end goal, yeah, sometimes you can look past everything that happened along the way, and it's just kind of a way of, I don't know, trapping yourself into a space of disappointment. And there's no benefit to it necessarily, unless you're using it to meet some sort of need within yourself, to feel like a failure, to feel like I set a goal that I didn't hit, that somehow makes me a more worthless person, or it makes me a helpless person, or whatever it is.
What I was trying to get at is that we're saying set specific goals, especially if you're in this kind of situation, so that you're not spiraling. But if you don't hit that one particular thing, if it's still in that general direction and you're still in a better position, you have to be okay and accept that. So, like, another example, like a client example, right? A lot of people say, oh my gosh, I really, they start working, with us, and they're like, I really want to get on stage. Like, it's a very extreme goal. It's a very, like, deliberate. There's a lot of steps towards it. And then along the way, they realize they don't necessarily want to do that. And instead, that was more of just kind of a thought that they had, or they thought that they wanted that. So then they kind of struggle with, like, well, should I still do it or should I not do it? It's like, well, what is the end goal? Is the end goal that you really wanted to be a competitive athlete, or you were setting this arbitrary goal that was going to help guide you along the way? So I think what I was trying to get at was, like, you can set specific goals, but if you do adjust them along the way, but you're still achieving those, like, the positive things in that direction.
Absolutely.
Like, you can't be upset with yourself, because a lot of people that we deal with, like, that is a real thing.
They can be upset. It's just
it's just
to what benefit is it serving at
exactly.
that point? But yeah. So one of the ways that I try and explain people, when I say be more flexible, it's kind of like, well, what does that actually look like? It means finding the things that you can control. What are the aspects of this that you can control that are within your power? It means make the decisions that you can make. If you're moving, find the neighborhood that you want to move to, find the house that you want to move into, find the school district, whatever it is. Allow the new experiences to kind of come into your life, whatever that is. It's up to you what part of control you want to take within situations like this. And I get it. Oftentimes people come to me because they're in a fair amount of pain. So I understand that. When they're seeing me, they're not in a happy place in their life. But the objective is to understand that this is temporary, and whatever this transition is, you will move past it. What you take from this process is completely up to you. So yeah, set goals, be flexible, make decisions, take control of what you can take control of, and let's start on the journey. Sometimes it's not going to be the end goal. It might be like, all right, this is the first step that I have to take to get to that next step. So it's just understanding of where you're going to be and what you want to do. So some of the things that I try and teach some of my clients is to recognize and recalibrate. Number one, pay attention to what you feel. First and foremost, whatever the emotion is, name it. And when I mean name it, I mean say it out loud, write it down. I don't care. Speak it to your husband, your wife, your boyfriend, your girlfriend, whatever it is. Start to say the emotion. When we speak the emotions, we actually begin to diminish the power that they have. This is what therapy actually is. This is why when a therapist comes in, one of the big questions is always, and this makes you feel what? And they're like anxious. And it's kind of like saying it doesn't make the anxiety go away. It doesn't make the problem go away, but now it gives it a name and it starts to give it a direction instead of it being this general thing that we don't have any control over. So by naming the emotion, it begins to identify what's happening inside you and where you want to go and what steps we need to take to cure the anxiety or to reduce it or diminish it. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Okay. No, for sure. And that's probably that's feedback I get with a lot of clients, and they'll be like, I'm feeling like a lot of these things, but I don't really know what, like, they're just like, I'm feeling off, or I'm, you know, they can't really name it, or they can't really identify where it's coming from. And I'm like, just, you have to just sit with that. And whether it's, and this often happens when people are forced to like stop, right? Like they're forced to like take some kind of a break, whether it's, their like job is changing, or I'm just thinking of somebody like surgery, or what, like, now you're home or you're sick, or like you're all of a sudden like you go, and then all of a sudden you stop, and then you're like, whoa, I can actually sit with these emotions, but I don't know what they mean and like where they're coming from. And it's like that I feel like generally happens when people are forced to stop, at least. And then you're allowed to recognize stuff, because otherwise it's just so easy to push it off. But okay, let's actually name it, right? Like, let's actually do something instead of just saying like, I'm feeling all like this. Like, okay, what specifically, where did we think that it came from? And sometimes you're not going to know those things. Like, it doesn't have to be like the perfect origin of like, oh, I know exactly why I'm feeling like this, because on this day at this time, like that doesn't matter. But like you said, naming it gives it something, and it allows you to move in some kind of a direction forward. Right. Again, instead of, the whole goal is when these life changes happen, or when any kind of transition happens, like the first thing that we want to do is just spiral, and we want everything to just kind of compound. And then it, like you said, do you want to feel bad for 2 or 3 months or a year? And that ultimately is up to you making a decision to say, okay, stop. What can I do to move forward? And the first part of that is literally identifying what is the problem. Because if you don't know what the problem is, then you're always going to feel like shit. Right. You're always going to feel, I'm tired, anxious, hungry, can't sleep, stressed out. That, like, okay, well, we can't be all those things all the time. We have to figure out how can we adjust these things, not feel like this.
Well, and the other side of it is there's 2 parts really to our brain. There's the reasoning mind, the rational mind, right? Where it's kind of like, okay, you're forced into moving. Your significant other lost their job. You can no longer afford the house that we have to change. So there's this rational part of you that says, all right, let's, like, what's our budget? Where are we going? That's all great. Like, pros and cons, decision-making time, no problem. But there's the other part of your mind that's the emotional part. And it's the part that a lot of people struggle with, even though mental health awareness is like growing and increasing. Emotional intelligence isn't.
Yeah.
And that's
awareness might be increasing.
Keyword. But I don't think people know what PTSD is now, but people don't pay attention to themselves or what's actually happening. And so losing your house, well, it's easy to say, all right, well, we're going to reduce our mortgage and live in this neighborhood and do these things. What you're also missing on is the last 10 years of memories that were in that house, the first Christmas that you had, or bringing the baby home, or whatever the situation is. And so there's an emotional side to these things that people aren't paying attention to. And that's the part that holds them up. So you're right, if you're just like, I don't know what I feel, start saying something. Like, are you angry today? Are you pissed? Like, what's the behavior that you're exhibiting right now? Are you like slamming shit around your house? Like, shutting doors and slamming the refrigerator? Okay, well, there's probably anger and frustration underneath that. And if we know there's anger and frustration, what else is fueling that? Because anger is like the most common emotion commonly expressed for people, especially in men. But there are other emotions that are underneath it that are pushing it to the surface. It's just the one that they want to show. So paying attention to those things. The second thing I tell people is to reframe. Reframing basically means you are in control of your mindset. I don't care what else is happening to you. You are in control of what you think. Case in point, Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl, right? I think we referenced this in like our very first podcast.
It's such a good book. Everybody, if you haven't read it, just stop what you're doing, stop listening, actually finish listening, and then go read it.
Yeah. And go to this website. No, I'm just kidding. But But Viktor Frankl, for those of you that don't know, he's the founder of modern day existentialism, and he was a survivor of the Holocaust, the Nazi prison camps. You know, and he took
Several.
Yeah. And he took from that the opportunity to grow. You have an opportunity to change what you think from these experiences and how you move forward. And there were some people who moved on from the Holocaust who had great success and had amazing life and experiences thereafter. And then there were people who, even though they didn't die in the prison camps, they may as well have. Their lives suffered. And so it's like, how can the same experience yield two completely different results for people? And the idea of it is just simply what you think about and how you think about it. Mm-hmm. So your mindset is your biggest asset in something like this. And what you really want to start to focus on is, we did a whole nother podcast on thinking errors. So if you guys haven't listened to that and you want more information, go to that one. But there are common thinking errors that we use, like rejecting the positive, which means focusing only on the negative things that are happening and none of the positive things. We catastrophize, right? This is taking one bad thing that's happening and we run it so far down the rabbit hole that our entire life is ruined and we can't go anywhere. All or nothing thinking. This is either all good or all bad. It's like, it's not really. Or we jump to conclusions. Things that haven't actually happened yet and we have no basis for them happening, we go to these places. And this tells me a lot about where the mindset is and how the person is viewing the problem, whether it's voluntary or involuntary, and where they're coming from with it. So first one, I would tell you to recognize and recalibrate what you're feeling, name your emotions. The second thing I would do is to tell you to challenge your mindset and where are you coming from with this. And I'm assuming as a coach, when people have setbacks, when people are making these big changes, this is something you run into a lot.
Oh, for sure. And that's why it's so important. And we wanted to talk about it. All the coaches were like, okay, we need to have a whole podcast on this, because this is the inevitable stuff, right? Like, we control a very small part of people's lives, or help control a small part of their lives, but everything influences what we do, right? So we hear about all of these things because obviously it makes sense. Mm-hmm. You know, if you lost your job this week, that is certainly going to influence the work that we do. Now, maybe I'm not going to be able to help fix that or help you get a new job, but we can help navigate it. So we have to work with clients on these kind of thinking errors and, you know, recalibrating how they're feeling. And probably my favorite thing from Viktor Frankl, one of my favorite things from him is how he really spoke about like the meaning in suffering. And obviously he lived that, and that's why he had this whole, you know, like field of psychology and all that. But like, I think like when I first started learning about that, understanding it, like it just made so much more sense. Like obviously like the human condition is based on suffering. Like we are always going to be suffering no matter what. And we have the choice to make that like better or worse, you know? And like, this isn't about, like objectifying somebody, not objectifying, like there's not weighing out somebody's suffering, one or the other. Like I'm not trying to make it sound like that, but it's okay. Everybody has suffering, especially if you're in a life transition that is probably negative. Like there's going to be suffering, but there is meaning in that if you can dissect that at a later point. But you also need to be able to move forward from it, and you can, no matter what the situation is, even though it's really, really hard. And I can't think of the word that I'm trying to use, but like I don't want to make it seem like somebody suffering is like better or worse than another one. Like that's not what I'm trying to say here. But it's like, okay, your own individual suffering, you can learn from that, and there is meaning there. And that was like when I first started learning about that, I was like, wow, like this is so impactful. Like I wish everybody had this lesson or learned about this, because I certainly didn't when I was growing up.
Yeah, he said about suffering, he said suffering ceases to be suffering the minute it has meaning and value. Yeah. So the second you can identify a purpose in what's happening, now it's like, this isn't happening, it's not suffering anymore. It's just what I need to do. It's the next step in the evolution to get where I need to go. This is a part of the process of obtaining it. Like, you can look at going back for your master's degree as a level of suffering. Like, I have to study more hours, time, money, all this. It's all suffering depending on how you want to look at it. Or you look at it and you say, all right, well, what's the end goal? Well, I want to be a therapist. Great. These are the things that I have to do to get to that. So it's with every rep, you get bigger, right? And the end goal is to be on stage or to weigh a certain amount or to look a certain way. That's just the process of having to go through it. Once you identify a purpose for this, it's not suffering anymore. It has value. And then when you can see the value in it, it changes your entire mindset and it allows you to attack it from a different perspective with a much higher percentage of success. So good. So,
yay, Viktor Frankl.
Yay. So one of the things that you can do to help kind of change your mindset is one of the things I try to tell people is to not look at the change as to what is necessarily going to be similar but different, and celebrate the differences. Because a lot of times when we're looking at change, and I'll use myself as an example, when I was moving from Chicago down to Tampa. Chicago, for those of you who have ever been to the city, know it's an amazing city. The only city even close to it is like New York. But we'll leave that aside. All the New Yorkers right now are like, there is no other city other than New York.
Chicago's way better than New York.
Yeah, Chicago's awesome.
New York, come at me. I don't care.
But my family, my friends, everybody was like, well, why would you leave Chicago, which is this incredible city, and go to Tampa? Not that Tampa's a bad city, but they were looking at it as to what makes, why Tampa isn't Chicago. They're like, they don't have this, they don't have that. What are you going to do down there? I was like, I'm not living in a swamp. I'm going to Tampa.
Everybody thinks Florida's like the Everglades.
And when my friends would come down for the first year, it was like, well, you don't have this or you don't have that. And it's like, no, but I have this.
Yeah.
And I have that. And I have the water and I have the ocean. And I have these different views and perspectives. And I don't have gray skies anymore. So one of the things that really helps is by identifying what is good about the change or what's different. And if you can embrace that, it makes it so much better. So I would encourage people to kind of focus on, don't look for similarities, look for differences that you'll actually like. What is going to be good about this place? The second thing, and this is really important, what are your expectations for this change? If this is something that you hate and it's just happening and you can't change it, that's fine. I get it. Sometimes we're a victim. We're all victims at some point in our life. But what good can come from this change? What good do you want to come from this change? It's happening, whether you want it to or not. What do you want to happen? You get to make some decisions here. You get to have some control on how this affects you. Whether it destroys your life or only partially destroys your life. Whether this is a few bad months or whether this is a few bad years. It's up to you. We get one life. You choose. I'm not going to make the choice for you. You get to do that. That's the beauty. So I always try and encourage people to stay forward thinking. By thinking about tomorrow and thinking about the next year, it takes you out of the pain and the suffering of today. And it gives you purpose. It gives you more meaning. It gives today more value when you know that that's the goal that you're looking for. That's the objective.
And I think that's where a lot of people are right now, right? So 2 examples that come up to my mind. Clients who are now working from home who don't want to be, right? Like they had a great office life, or they were in the office part-time and traveling the other part of the time, and now they're completely swamped working from home, like at their kitchen table, right? Like that's a very big transition. And a lot of these places are saying, yeah, next month. And then next month rolls around and then, oh, it's 3 more months. And then they just keep, it seems like it's infinite, right? And it might be, but you likely will be able to go back to what you used to do, right? Same thing with obviously school right now with a lot of kids. Every state is very different, every school is different. So some kids are back full time, others are completely at home learning, some are doing like a mix, but whatever is happening right now, unless life is the same for your child, which that's great if it is, but if it's not, life will eventually resume. But like, what can you do at this point? I know a lot of people who are like, oh, we're gonna homeschool now, and that's working amazing for them. And there's other people who are like, nope, I'm going to send them to a different school. I realized this school wasn't maybe the best for them. They're going to go here. Or, listen, we don't really have an option. This is all that we can do. And we just have to get through this. But at some point, it will get back to normal. And how can I support my kids during this period? So I think that while it seems like when there isn't a deadline for things, that's what's so hard for people. Everybody, like if you could say like, hey, this is going to be really, really bad for a year, you could be like, okay, like I'll prep for it. But if it's uncertain and bad for like 3 months, that feels like fucking 15 years. You know what I mean? But instead of focusing on that, like you said, okay, how can you address what are some of the negatives right now? That's what we try to do with clients with really everything. Okay, what are some of the things that you're struggling with right now, like literally right now? Why is this not working? Because you're not doing X or you are doing Y, and that's creating this problem. So let's do that. And then also, like you said, future thinking about, okay, this will get back to normal at some point. I don't know when, but it will. And what are the changes that I can make immediately now to help my situation?
Changes always change until it becomes the new normal. And that's just the reality of life.
Don't say that phrase right now.
The new normal.
God. If I hear that, what's the other one that they always use? There's like another thing that's like.
I used it before the pandemic.
Okay.
All right. The pandemic does not own my phrases.
Change your vocabulary.
No.
We all have PTSD from new normal.
That is
so
a life transition I'm not making.
You're literally creating PTSD. Okay.
Right.
New normal 2020? What? It's gonna be like in 10 years people are freaking out.
So the last couple of points that I just want to make on the topic is anxiety is very typical in situations like this. It is probably the number one most common emotion because anxiety incorporates fear, it incorporates uncertainty, it incorporates doubt, and it really just breeds into people's life when major change occurs. So anxiety is the number one thing. But once you understand that anxiety is a temporary emotion and that once you start the process, what's to come after it is confidence. Think of it like this. The very first time you were going to college or school or doing something, walking into a jiu-jitsu class for the first time, you feel anxious or nervous. It's your first semester as a graduate student. You're sitting in that first class or the couple of weeks before, you're anxious. And what ends up happening is when we look at the person who is experiencing something for the very first time versus somebody who's experienced like the first day, first semester, first day, second semester, completely different person. They're much more confident. The person who's showing up for the first day of class, a month into it or 3 months into it, they feel confident. They know the place, they know the routines, they know the people, they know what's going to happen or what to expect at least. Why the change? Nothing is actually different except for the fact that you've become more familiar with it. So anxiety will always fade if you give it enough time, if you give it the attention that it deserves. So if you're anxious, start to figure out why. Write it down, talk to somebody, figure out what it is that you're actually anxious about, and then get in the process of doing something so that you can overcome that anxiety. Because as soon as you do that, you'll feel more calm, you'll feel more peaceful, and confidence will start to build again. The change won't be as bad. It'll be like, yeah, this wasn't that bad. You can start handling more things. So this brings us to what we were talking about kind of with Viktor Frankl, kind of wrapping it all up, which is how we deal with stress, which any change is going to be stressful. And so we have imposed voluntary and involuntary stressors. So when something is a voluntary stressor, meaning we've taken it on from our own choice and we decide that this is something that I want to do, whether that's competing on stage or taking an art class or whatever it is, it's going to be stressful. But when you decide that it's a choice that you've made, your entire mindset and body shift. And then it takes it from this is something that is going to be negative and it takes it to kind of like an approach and a challenge. Right? Rather than this being something like I just have to endure. And so more positive emotions come from it. You literally engage that system of your body where it's like, this is an opportunity and a challenge for me. And so now I want to do it. And so and the stress doesn't impact your body in a negative way. It actually helps fuel you because it's much less hard. You're not using that defensive posture because you're not fighting the change the whole way. When it's something that you've wanted, you kind of go after it, versus the involuntary stressors, which are things that like you didn't want and you're going to resist. Well, now you're going to be defensive. Now you're going to be aggressive. You're going to be more withdrawn. You're going to avoid things and you're going to have a lot more negative emotions. Why? Because this is a threat to you. And so when you can take it from this is a challenge and an opportunity, or you keep it as a threat and this is dangerous, your body's going to respond either way. Your body will take its cues from what you think and your mindset. A colleague of mine has a quote on the wall. It says, if you ever knew if you ever knew the impact of a negative thought, you'd never have one again. And it's just really talks about and gets into the mindset that a person has when dealing with stressors.
I love all the stress perception research. When I found that, I was like, oh my God, because for so long, everybody always talked about stress as just like, oh, stress is bad, stress is this, stress is killing you, da-da-da. And we've talked about this, exhaustively on different podcasts. I talk about this all the time with clients. Like, we always refer back to, it's called The Upside of Stress. It's one of my favorite books from Kelly McGonigal. She's out of Stanford. And there's this other researcher there, I think it's Aaliyah, but it's Crum, C-R-U-M. She does a ton of stress perception research out of Stanford as well. And it's just, they've looked at it down to the hormonal level, like different hormones are secreted when you look at stress as either debilitating or challenging, and it is so cool. Like the nerd inside of me is like, oh my God, this is amazing. It's like, it's literally like your body knows like how to respond and release things properly. But it's been jammed down our throats like, oh, stress is killing you. And if you only think that stress is bad, then you are always going to think of it as debilitating, and you are going to have the improper hormonal secretions and all of the negative side effects that come with stress, in these air quotes, right? Instead of, change is inevitable, life transitions are inevitable, stress is inevitable. But if we look at it and reframe it in this, okay, this is a challenge kind of way. And we all know people, like, if this isn't you, this is something that we all have to work on. But, I think we all have people in our lives who we can look to and be like, wow, like I know a person who's like that. Like, adversity hits and they rise up to the challenge, or like something really stressful happens and like they're on top of it. And like, that person is of course probably still having to make that mental note. It's not like it's just easy for them, but they're looking at it in that positive and challenging way. And hopefully you have more than one person in your life who does that. But if you don't, it is possible. It just does take a lot of mental reframing and a lot of work. And for the millionth time, I'm going to plug it again, The Upside of Stress. It's such a good book, and it is fully cited. So if you want to read all the other research too, you can, because that's what I like to do.
Yeah. And, that really kind of brings us full circle with the topic. The way you think about something and how you recalibrate your mind is just going to be critical. And understand this too, depending on the life change, some people are going to thrive more with certain changes, and they're not going to be as great at adapting to other changes. You may be great at, I don't know, if you've lost your job, you might be the kind of person who's like, yep, I'm going to get right back up, fill out my resume and go. Whereas another person might be like, oh my God, this is the most devastating thing that's ever happened to me. However, that same person who like struggles to find their job, they maybe come across that they've just recently been diagnosed with cancer, and they're like, oh hell yeah, this isn't going to beat me. But the guy who like lost his job and who's now diagnosed with cancer might be like, oh my God, I'm going to die. So try not to judge all of your life circumstances or your transitions based off of what you've done previously. You always have the ability to adapt and overcome, and just because you may have sucked or done something really poorly at one point in your life, it doesn't mean that this next transition is going to follow that same path, because they're all different. They're happening at a different point in your life. A transition that happened 10 years ago, you are not the same person that you were 10 years ago. You have new resources, new knowledge, new support systems, hopefully. Hopefully you've changed and evolved in some direction.
And if you haven't, here is your sign that you might need to.
Call me.
Here's your gentle sign that you might need to work on that.
Right. And then it really starts to hit on your level of self-esteem. And when you are able to identify this was a major life transition and you worked through it and you adapted to the change, it starts to help you view yourself as a more worthwhile person, because you saw yourself with a challenge in front of you, a risk, and you took it, but not in a naive way. You didn't do it from this uneducated perspective, or you were uninformed. You were informed. You weren't naive. You aren't uneducated. So you took on this challenge and you overcame it. This is what we talk about later in therapy when somebody's like, oh, this is happening. It's kind of like, yeah, but you've had these other experiences that you overcame. And you're like, yep, that I did. And people can't really hide from it anymore. And so that's what helps bring up your self-esteem as a person. And that's a great thing, because then what you're doing is you're finding something worthwhile about yourself and you're expressing it. And so you as a person have completely changed. And so that's kind of the end goal, where it's like when a person comes to me in pain versus when they're like, yeah, I no longer need you anymore. Like, okay, like I'm lucky if I get to thank you. But, and then they kind of move on their way. That's just life. But they're in a different mindset, a different space. The change has happened and they've overcome it, and now they're into their new life. So
we hope that this was insightful with a few different examples and ways of looking at it. But regardless of what you're going through, hopefully the central message was pretty clear on how to help handle it. And actually our next podcast is the first anonymous question podcast. We still don't have a name for that, so everybody, it's still called Anonymous Questions. I really need to come up with a good name. If I could just install some creativity, that would be amazing. But we are actually going to discuss something that kind of builds upon this, which I actually didn't really plan, but it worked out perfectly. And this person is struggling with a very specific life transition and kind of what direction to go. So if you have any other specific questions that you would like us to address, whether they are mental health related or nutrition coaching related, we will have that link below in the show notes, and we'll also put the 2 book links in there too, because I know I'll hear people like talk about stuff on a podcast and I'm like, wait, what was that called? So we'll link both of those below, as well as Rick's email if you're interested in mental health consulting. So thank you guys as always for listening, and we'll talk to you Wednesday.